High in the frozen peaks of Montana, a homeless teenage boy named Eli survived each bitter night in an abandoned miner's shack, invisible to the world below. He had nothing but the clothes on his back and a fierce will to endure. When he stumbled into a storage unit auction in the valley town, desperate for shelter from an approaching blizzard, he never imagined the rusted padlock he'd win for $5 would change everything. The unit belonged to a tech billionaire who had vanished without a trace, and inside, buried beneath boxes of forgotten memories, Eli discovered something that powerful people had spent years trying to erase. What secret had the billionaire hidden in that cold metal tomb? Could a homeless boy with nothing outrun the men in dark suits now hunting him through the wilderness? And why would one night transform him from a forgotten orphan into the most dangerous witness alive? The descent from the high country was a brutal negotiation with gravity and ice. Eli moved with the careful, deliberate steps of someone who understood that a single mistake on the steep, frost-slicked trail could mean a fall that would leave him broken on the rocks below, where no one would find him until the spring thaw revealed what the winter had claimed. The snow was falling harder now, thick wet flakes that clung to his eyelashes and melted against the exposed skin of his face, and the temperature was dropping with each 100 feet of elevation he surrendered. His boots, held together with duct tape and wire, found purchase on roots and stones, and his hands, chapped and raw, gripped the rough bark of trees to steady himself on the steeper sections. It took him 3 hours to cover the 12 miles, his legs burning with the effort, his lungs aching from the cold air. But as the trail finally leveled out, and the first scattered buildings of Timber Ridge appeared through the curtain of falling snow, he felt not relief, but a profound anxiety that made his chest tighten. He was entering a world where he did not belong, where his appearance would mark him immediately as an outsider, as someone to be pitied or feared, or simply ignored. The town itself was small, a single main street lined with false-fronted buildings that had weathered 100 Montana winters, their paint faded and peeling, their wooden sidewalks dusted with snow. A handful of pickup trucks were parked at angles in front of the general store, and a few bundled figures hurried between buildings, their heads down against the wind. Eli kept to the edges, moving along the side streets, trying to be invisible, even as he knew his ragged appearance drew eyes. He passed a diner, where the windows glowed with warm yellow light, and the smell of frying bacon made his empty stomach clench with hunger. But he had no money for such luxuries. He passed a laundromat, a hardware store, a small clinic, all of them closed or closing as the storm worsened. What he needed was temporary shelter, a barn, or a garage, or even an unlocked shed where he could wait out the worst of the blizzard. But everywhere he looked, he saw locks and lights, and the signs of human habitation that meant he could not simply slip inside unseen. He was about to circle back toward the edge of town to find a place in the trees where he could at least get out of the wind, when he heard voices coming from a large metal building near the railroad tracks. The sign above the rolling door read, "Rocky Mountain Storage" in faded red letters, and a small crowd of perhaps 20 people was gathering near the entrance, stamping their feet against the cold, and talking in the animated way of people anticipating something interesting. Eli moved closer, staying in the shadows, listening. An auction, he heard. A storage unit auction for units with unpaid rent. The contents sold to the highest bidder. Happens twice a year. Good deals if you know what you are looking for. Mostly junk, but sometimes you find something valuable. The crowd was an odd mix of local antique dealers, bargain hunters, and curious retirees looking for entertainment on a cold afternoon. The auctioneer, a heavy-set man in a sheepskin coat, was setting up a portable podium near the entrance, and people were filing inside, their voices echoing in the cavernous space. Eli felt a pull he could not quite explain, a desperate curiosity born of 2 years of isolation and a life lived on the absolute edge of survival. Perhaps there would be something useful in one of the units, something he could use or trade, or perhaps the building itself would offer shelter for a few hours while the storm raged outside. He slipped his hand into his pocket and felt the crumpled bills there. $5.37. Everything he had in the world, earned from selling rabbit pelts to a trapper he had met on the mountain 6 months ago. It was not much, but it was enough to make him feel, for just a moment, like he had the right to walk through that door with the others. He pulled his hood up, ducked his head, and followed the crowd inside, becoming just another face in the auction, invisible and forgotten, exactly as he had been for 2 long years. Inside the metal building, the air was cold but still, a blessed relief from the cutting wind outside, and the crowd settled onto folding chairs, arranged in rows facing a line of storage units that stretched into the shadowed depths of the warehouse. Eli took a seat in the very back, his body tense, hyper-aware of the eyes that occasionally glanced his way, taking in his ragged appearance, and then quickly looking away with the studied indifference people reserved for the homeless and the desperate. The auctioneer, whose name tag read Dale Richter, began his practiced routine, explaining the rules in a voice that had the rhythmic quality of a man who had given this speech 1,000 times. All sales final, cash or certified check only. You buy the contents as is, where is. You have 24 hours to clear out your purchase. Management is not responsible for the accuracy of any inventory. The first few units went quickly, their contents visible through the raised rolling doors. A unit full of dusty furniture that went for $85 to a woman who owned an antique shop. A unit packed with boxes of old books and vinyl records that a young couple bought for $60. A unit containing nothing but broken appliances and trash that no one bid on at all. Eli watched the process with growing understanding, seeing how the experienced bidders evaluated each unit in seconds, calculating value against risk, and he realized he was completely out of his depth in this world of negotiation and appraisal. The auction moved steadily through the rows until Dale stopped in front of Unit 237, a larger unit at the far end, its door firmly closed and secured with both a padlock and a thick chain. Dale's jovial manner shifted slightly, becoming more formal, almost careful, as he consulted his clipboard and cleared his throat. This unit, he announced, had been abandoned for 5 years, with unpaid fees, totaling over $6,000. The contents were unknown, as the owner had never allowed inspection, and the previous renter was Marcus Vance, and here Dale paused as a murmur rippled through the crowd. Everyone in Montana knew that name, even Eli, who had spent 2 years divorced from the news and gossip of civilization. Marcus Vance had been a tech billionaire, one of the founders of Titan Technologies, a man whose face had been on magazine covers, and whose sudden disappearance 5 years ago had spawned countless theories: suicide, murder, escape to a foreign country, witness protection. The case had never been solved, the body never found, and his estate had been tied up in legal battles ever since. Dale continued, his voice taking on the practiced tone of a man reciting a legal disclaimer. Bidding on this unit came with certain complications. The winning bidder would need to sign additional paperwork, acknowledging that any contents of significant value might be subject to estate claims. Titan Technologies had formally disclaimed any interest in the contents, but potential bidders should be aware of possible legal entanglements. The effect of this speech was immediate and chilling. The crowd, which had been animated and competitive, fell into an uneasy silence. The experienced dealers exchanged glances and shook their heads, wanting no part of something that might drag them into court. Dale opened the bidding at $500, a formality given the unpaid fees, but no hands went up. He dropped it to $250, then $100, then $50, his voice growing slightly desperate as the silence stretched on. At $25, one man raised his hand tentatively, then immediately lowered it when his wife grabbed his arm and whispered urgently in his ear. Dale sighed, ready to declare the unit a no-sale, when a voice from the back, thin and uncertain, called out a number that made every head turn. $5, Eli said, his heart hammering, not understanding why he had spoken. knowing only that something in the mystery of that locked unit called to him with a force he could not explain. Dale blinked, looking at the ragged boy in the back row, then shrugged with the resignation of a man who just wanted to finish his job. "Going once," he called. "Going twice. Sold to the young man in the back for $5. Congratulations, son. You just bought yourself a mystery." The paperwork took 15 minutes, Eli's hand shaking slightly as he signed his name on forms he barely understood. And Dale handed him a heavy bolt cutter with a skeptical look that suggested he expected the boy to find nothing but disappointment behind that locked door. The other bidders had already dispersed, loading their purchases into trucks and vans as the storm intensified outside. And soon Eli stood alone in front of Unit 237, the metal building echoing with emptiness and the distant howl of the wind. He positioned the bolt cutter's jaws around the padlock's shackle, squeezed with all his strength, and felt the satisfying snap as the hardened steel gave way. The chain followed, clattering to the concrete floor with a sound that seemed too loud in the cavernous space, and then he was gripping the handle of the rolling door, hesitating for just a moment before heaving it upward. The door rose with a metallic shriek, revealing a space that was 10 feet wide and 20 feet deep, and even in the dim light that filtered in from the overhead fixtures, Eli could see that this was no ordinary storage unit. The furniture was expensive, the kind he had seen in catalogues at the library. Sleek, modern pieces in dark wood and leather that had probably cost more than most people earned in a year. A desk, a chair, a small sofa, all of it covered in a thick layer of undisturbed dust that spoke of years of absolute stillness. Boxes were stacked along the walls, labeled in neat handwriting with words like files, personal, photos, electronics, and against the back wall stood a workbench holding computer monitors, keyboards, and other technology that meant nothing to Eli, who had never owned a phone or touched a computer in his life. He stepped inside, his boots leaving prints in the dust, and began to explore his inheritance with a mixture of wonder and growing disappointment. The furniture was beautiful, but useless to him, far too large and heavy to move, and worth nothing without a buyer who could afford such things. The electronics were surely valuable ones, but without power, passwords, or any way to authenticate them, they were just expensive paperweights that he could never sell without raising questions he could not answer. He opened one of the boxes labeled Personal, and found clothes, expensive shirts and jackets still on hangers, shoes that had never been worn, a watch that might be worth something if he could find someone willing to buy it from a ragged mountain boy without asking where it came from. It was not the treasure he had not allowed himself to hope for, but it was shelter, and as the wind screamed outside and the temperature continued its relentless drop, that was worth more than gold. He pushed the rolling door back down, sealing himself inside, and used the bolt cutter to jam it closed from within, creating a space that was cold but dry and protected from the storm. He arranged some of the clothes into a makeshift bed on the sofa, pulled a jacket over himself as a blanket, and lay in the darkness, listening to the building groan and creak around him. It was then, in the absolute stillness, that he noticed something wrong. The unit felt smaller than it should, as if the space did not quite match the dimensions he had seen from outside, and when he stood and walked to the back wall, running his hands over the smooth drywall surface, he realized with a sudden certainty that the wall was not where it should be. The math was simple, even for someone whose formal education had ended at 14. The unit was 20 feet deep from the outside, but from the rolling door to this back wall was perhaps 15 feet at most. 5 feet of space had vanished, swallowed by a wall that should not exist, and as his fingers found a seam hidden in the shadows, a crack so perfectly fitted that it was nearly invisible, Eli understood that Marcus Vance had not just stored his possessions here. He had built something, hidden something, and whatever secret lay beyond that false wall had been waiting 5 years for someone to find it. It took Eli an hour of systematic exploration, moving boxes and furniture, running his hands along every inch of the back wall, before he found the mechanism that would reveal what Marcus Vance had hidden. The seam he had discovered was part of a section of drywall, approximately 4 feet wide, and when he applied pressure to a specific point near the floor, he heard a soft click as a magnetic lock disengaged. The entire section swung inward on concealed hinges, revealing a narrow doorway that opened into absolute darkness. Eli used his small flashlight, a dollar store purchase that had survived 2 years of mountain living, and stepped through into a space that was roughly 8 feet square, a hidden room that had been constructed with meticulous care and considerable expense. The walls were lined with what appeared to be soundproofing material, and the air inside was dry and still, preserved by some kind of climate control system that must have run until the power was cut 5 years ago. Against the far wall sat a fireproof safe, the kind used for documents and data. Its electronic keypad dark and lifeless, but its heavy steel construction promising that whatever lay inside had been protected from time and decay. Next to the safe, resting on a small metal shelf, was a laptop computer sealed inside a clear plastic bag with desiccant packets to prevent moisture damage, and next to that, a stack of external hard drives similarly preserved. But it was the left wall that made Eli's breath catch in his throat, for it had been transformed into something that looked like the work of either a meticulous investigator or a man descending into obsession. The entire surface was covered in papers, photographs, newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes, all of it arranged in a pattern that suggested connections and relationships that Eli could not yet understand. There were photographs of men in expensive suits standing in front of corporate buildings, their faces circled in red marker, and beneath each photo were handwritten annotations listing names, dates, and what appeared to be accusations. There were printed documents bearing the letterhead of Titan Technologies, pages of financial records, internal memos, and technical reports, many of them marked with highlighter and angry marginalia in the same precise handwriting. There were maps, topographical surveys of Montana wilderness areas, with specific locations marked with red X symbols, and next to these maps were photographs of remote mountain locations, some showing what appeared to be industrial equipment or storage tanks hidden among the trees. There were photographs of newspapers with headlines about environmental contamination, unexplained illnesses in rural communities, and the suspicious deaths of activists and whistleblowers. Every piece of paper, every photograph, every note bore the same evidence of a single man's exhaustive investigation into something vast and terrible. Eli moved closer, his flashlight beam traveling across the wall, and he saw that the arrangement was not random, but chronological, telling a story that began with corporate documents from 8 years ago and ended with increasingly desperate handwritten notes dated just days before Marcus Vance disappeared. At the center of it all, written in large letters on a piece of paper that had been pinned above the safe, were the words, "They know. They are coming. If you are reading this, I am already dead. Finish what I started." The message was not addressed to anyone specific, but it carried the weight of a dying man's plea, a final desperate attempt to ensure that the truth would survive, even if he did not. Eli stood in the hidden room, surrounded by the evidence of Marcus Vance's secret war, and felt the magnitude of what he had stumbled into pressing down on him like the weight of the mountain itself. This was not just storage, not just the forgotten possessions of a missing man. This was a weapon, carefully prepared and deliberately hidden, waiting for someone to find it and use it against powerful people who thought they had buried the truth forever. Among the papers pinned to the wall, Eli found an envelope that was different from the others, made of heavy cream-colored paper and sealed with red wax that had been broken and then carefully taped back together, as if Marcus Vance had written the letter, sealed it, then opened it again to add one final thought before his time ran out. The envelope was addressed in bold black ink, "To whoever finds this," and inside were 3 pages of handwritten text, the script hurried in places but still legible. the words of a man who knew he was writing his own epitaph. Eli sat on the cold floor of the hidden room and read by flashlight, and with each sentence, the scope of what he had inherited became more terrifying and more clear. The letter began simply. My name is Marcus Vance, and if you are reading this, it means I failed to survive long enough to expose the truth myself, which means they won and I am dead, and I am so deeply sorry to place this burden on your shoulders, but I have no one else to turn to. Vance explained that he had been one of the founding partners of Titan Technologies, a company that manufactured specialized electronics and industrial sensors, and for years he had believed they were building something meaningful, something that would change the world for the better. But 3 years into his tenure, he had discovered that the company's manufacturing process produced enormous quantities of toxic waste, heavy metals, and industrial solvents that were supposed to be disposed of through expensive, regulated channels. Instead, the other partners, led by a man named Raymond Kovac, had been illegally dumping the waste in remote locations across Montana, bribing local officials to look the other way, and falsifying EPA reports to hide the contamination. When Vance confronted them, demanded they stop and clean up the damage, they had offered him a choice: accept a substantial payout and sign a non-disclosure agreement, or be destroyed. He had refused, and that was when the campaign against him began. His reputation attacked, his finances audited, his personal life invaded, and finally, credible threats made against the one thing he could not bear to lose: his 19-year-old daughter, Sophie. The letter detailed how Vance had spent months secretly gathering evidence, copying files, recording conversations, documenting the dump sites, and building an irrefutable case against Titan and everyone involved in the conspiracy. He had planned to go to the authorities, but he learned that the corruption ran deeper than he imagined, that Titan had purchased protection from county sheriffs, state environmental officials, and even federal inspectors. He realized that going public without careful preparation would be suicide, that he needed to get Sophie to safety first, and that he needed an insurance policy that would ensure the truth survived, even if he did not. So he had staged his own disappearance, placed Sophie in witness protection under a false identity, though she did not know why, and hidden the evidence where it would eventually be found. The safe, he wrote, contained the original documents, video testimony, location data for the dump, sites, and a comprehensive record of every bribe, every falsified report, and every person involved. The laptop held encrypted backups of everything. The letter ended with a plea that was also a command. There is a journalist named Ben Carter in Seattle. He specializes in corporate corruption and environmental crimes. His contact information is in the safe. He is the only person I trust with this. Please get the evidence to him. Please finish what I started. Please do not let my death be meaningless. Please save the people who are being poisoned while Titan profits from their suffering. I am begging you. Whoever you are, please do not walk away. The morning after discovering the hidden room, Eli woke stiff and cold on the leather sofa, the storm outside having exhausted itself during the night, leaving behind a world buried under 2 feet of fresh snow and a sky of brilliant, pitiless blue. He had spent hours reading and rereading Marcus Vance's letter, examining the documents on the wall, and staring at the fireproof safe that he had no way to open, its electronic keypad as impenetrable as the encryption that surely protected the laptop. He understood that he held evidence of terrible crimes, that people had died to keep these secrets buried, but the knowledge was useless to him without a way to access it, to verify it, to understand exactly what he was looking at. The letter mentioned a journalist in Seattle, but Seattle might as well have been on the moon for a homeless 16-year-old boy, with no phone, no computer, and no way to contact anyone beyond the borders of this small mountain town. He needed help, and after 2 years of self-imposed isolation, the thought of asking for it made his stomach clench with anxiety. He decided to take the sealed laptop into town to find someone who might help him access it, or at least tell him what he was dealing with. He rewrapped the laptop in its protective bag, tucked it into his rucksack, along with a few of the less incriminating documents, and made his way through the snow-covered streets of Timber Ridge until he found what he was looking for. A small storefront with a hand-painted sign that read, "Ruth's Internet Cafe and Books." The interior was warm and smelled of coffee and old paper, a combination that reminded Eli of the public library, where he had spent so many afternoons before his life fell apart. Behind the counter stood an elderly woman with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, wearing a cardigan covered in cat hair and reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She looked up as the bell above the door chimed, and her face, which had started to form the usual expression people wore when they saw Eli, shifted into something gentler, something that looked almost like understanding. Her name was Ruth, and she did not ask questions when Eli explained that he needed to use a computer but had no money, only offering him a simple deal: sweep the floors, wipe down the tables, and take out the trash, and he could use the computer in the back for as long as he needed. He agreed immediately, grateful beyond words, and spent the next hour working with a focused intensity that made Ruth smile and bring him a sandwich and a cup of hot coffee, without being asked. When the cafe was spotless, she led him to a small room in the back, where an older desktop computer sat on a cluttered desk, and she left him alone with a pat on his shoulder and instructions to holler if he needed anything. Eli carefully removed the laptop from its protective bag, found an outlet, and plugged in the power cord, watching as the machine came to life with a soft electronic hum. The screen flickered, showing a login prompt that required a password he did not have, but what Eli could not see, what he had no way of knowing, was that the moment the laptop connected to power, a hidden subroutine embedded deep in its firmware activated. It was a failsafe Marcus Vance had installed, a final desperate measure. If the laptop was ever powered on after his disappearance, it would immediately begin transmitting a GPS signal through any available network, a beacon designed to alert Sophie that the evidence had been found. But Sophie's contact information had been changed when she entered witness protection, and the signal, instead of reaching her, pinged against a monitoring system that Titan Technologies had installed 5 years ago to watch for exactly this eventuality. 300 miles away, in a secure office in Billings, an alert appeared on a screen, showing coordinates, a timestamp, and a location: Timber Ridge, Montana. Within minutes, phone calls were made, orders were given, and 2 men in dark suits began preparing for a drive into the mountains. Eli had been marked, tracked, and targeted, and he sat in the back room of Ruth's cafe, completely unaware that his $5 purchase had just painted a bullseye on his back that powerful people would do anything to eliminate. After an hour of frustrated attempts to bypass the laptop's encryption, Eli admitted defeat and returned to the main room of the cafe, where Ruth was restocking the bookshelves with the careful movements of someone whose body had begun to betray her with age, but whose mind remained sharp and observant. She took one look at his face and gestured for him to sit at a small table near the window, then brought him another sandwich, a bowl of soup, and a slice of apple pie that she insisted was left over from yesterday and would just go to waste if he did not eat it. As he ate with the focused intensity of someone who had gone too long between meals, she sat across from him and asked, in a voice that was gentle but left no room for deflection, if he was in some kind of trouble. Eli hesitated, the habits of 2 years of isolation warring with a desperate need to trust someone, and finally he told her a carefully edited version of the truth, that he had won a storage unit at auction, that it had belonged to a man who disappeared years ago, that he had found some things that seemed important but did not know what to do with them. He did not mention the hidden room, the evidence of crimes, or the letter that had placed the weight of a dead man's mission on his shoulders, but even this abbreviated confession seemed to unlock something in Ruth's expression, a knowing sadness that suggested she understood far more than he had said. She leaned forward, her weathered hands wrapped around her coffee cup, and told him that he needed to be very careful, that 2 men in expensive suits had been in town the day before, asking questions at the storage facility and showing photographs to people on the street. They had claimed to be lawyers for the Vance estate, she said, but something about them felt wrong, felt dangerous, and the storage facility manager had been far too eager to answer their questions and take their money. Ruth explained that her late husband, Daniel, had been an environmental activist who spent the last years of his life investigating strange clusters of illness in the mountain communities around Timber Ridge, rare cancers and neurological conditions that seemed to have no natural explanation. He had been convinced that someone was contaminating the water, that corporate interests were putting profit above human life, and he had made himself a nuisance to powerful people by asking questions and filing complaints. 5 years ago, his truck had gone off a mountain road during a storm, a tragic accident that everyone accepted without question. But Ruth had never believed it, had always known in her heart that Daniel had been killed for getting too close to a truth that someone needed to keep buried. She looked at Eli, with eyes that held both sorrow and a fierce, undiminished fire, and told him that if he had found something that powerful people wanted to stay hidden, then he was in more danger than he could possibly understand, and he needed to have a way out. She stood, went to the drawer behind the counter, and returned with a small burner phone, still in its plastic packaging, and a hand-drawn map. The phone was for emergencies, she said, already activated and loaded with 60 minutes of prepaid time, and the map showed the location of a cabin that had belonged to Daniel, 15 miles into the high country, on a trail that was not marked on any official map. The cabin was rustic, off the grid, stocked with basic supplies, and known to no one but her, a place where someone could disappear completely if the world became too dangerous. She pressed both items into Eli's hands, and made him promise that if he felt threatened, if those men came looking for him, he would not hesitate to run to that cabin and stay there until she could figure out how to help him. For the first time in 2 years, Eli felt the sting of tears behind his eyes, overwhelmed by this act of kindness from a stranger who owed him nothing, and he managed only a whispered thank you before Ruth patted his hand and told him that he reminded her of Daniel, that same stubborn refusal to look away from injustice, and she would be damned if she let another good person get hurt without doing everything in her power to protect them. Eli left Ruth's cafe as the afternoon light began to fade, the burner phone and map tucked safely in his jacket pocket, and made his way back through the snow-covered streets toward the storage facility, intending to spend one more night in Unit 237 before deciding his next move. The sky was darkening again, another storm system moving in from the north, and the temperature was dropping with the kind of speed that promised a brutal night ahead. He was half a block from the facility when something made him stop, some instinct honed by 2 years of survival in a place where inattention meant death, and he pressed himself into the shadow of a closed hardware store and watched. 2 vehicles were parked in front of the storage facility office, one a black SUV with tinted windows and rental plates, the other a silver sedan that looked expensive and out of place in this working-class mountain town. As Eli watched, 2 men emerged from the office, and even from a distance, he could see they did not belong here. They wore suits that probably cost more than most people in Timber Ridge earned in a month, dark wool overcoats against the cold, and leather shoes that were completely impractical for the snowy streets. One was tall and broad-shouldered, moving with the controlled precision of someone who had done violence and would do it again without hesitation, while the other was lean and sharp-featured, carrying a tablet computer and gesturing as he spoke. They were followed by Dale, the auctioneer and facility manager, whose body language screamed nervous cooperation, and the 3 men stood near the SUV, their breath steaming in the cold air as Dale pointed toward the building, and then pulled out his phone to show them something. Eli could not hear their conversation from this distance, but he watched as the lean man took the phone, examined whatever was on the screen, and nodded with satisfaction before handing it back along with what appeared to be a thick envelope of cash. Dale pocketed the money with the guilty speed of a man who knew he was betraying someone, glanced around as if worried about being observed, and then hurried back into the office while the 2 men climbed into the SUV and sat there, clearly planning to wait. Eli's heart was hammering now, adrenaline sharpening his senses, and he understood with absolute clarity that Dale had sold him out, had shown them security camera footage from the auction, had given them Eli's description, and probably told them that the boy had no money, no family, and no one who would miss him if he disappeared. The trap was set, and if Eli had walked into the facility without stopping, without trusting that animal instinct that had kept him alive on the mountain, he would have walked straight into the arms of men who had already killed at least once to protect their secrets. He could not go back, could not retrieve his few possessions from the unit, could not even risk being seen near the facility. But he also could not leave empty-handed, not when everything Marcus Vance had died to preserve was locked behind that rolling door. He circled wide through the back streets, approaching the facility from the rear, where the storage units backed up against a chain-link fence, and used the bolt cutter he had kept in his rucksack to create an opening. The units had no rear access, but the walls were just thin metal, and in the gathering darkness, he worked quickly and quietly to pry open a section of Unit 237's back wall, squeezing through into the hidden room where the evidence waited. He had perhaps 5 minutes before someone heard him or the men in the SUV decided to make their move. He grabbed Marcus Vance's letter, folded it carefully, and tucked it into his jacket, then took a dozen of the most damning documents come from the wall, selecting ones that showed clear evidence of criminal activity. The safe was still locked, but he remembered seeing a USB drive on the metal shelf, and he grabbed it, praying it contained copies of the evidence. Then he was squeezing back through the hole, running through the snow toward the edge of town as the storm rolled in and the darkness fell like a curtain, knowing that he had just declared war on people who had infinite resources and absolutely no mercy, and his only allies were a kind old woman and the ghost of a dead billionaire who had failed to survive his own rebellion. Eli did not run blindly into the night, but moved with the calculated efficiency of someone who had spent 2 years learning to read the mountain's moods and respect its power, and within 10 minutes of leaving the storage facility, he had crossed the town's eastern boundary and was climbing into the high timber where the snow lay deep and undisturbed. Behind him, he heard the distant sound of engines starting, voices shouting, and he knew the men had discovered his break-in and were mobilizing to pursue him, but they were making the fatal mistake of underestimating both the terrain and the boy who had made it his home. Ruth's map was committed to memory. The route burned into his mind during the hours he had spent studying it at the cafe, and he moved steadily upward through the darkness, using the ghostly light of the snow to navigate, following game trails and natural corridors that would be invisible to anyone who did not know what to look for. The storm was intensifying with every passing minute, the wind screaming through the pines and the snow falling so thick it created a disorienting white curtain that erased the world beyond arm's reach. But these conditions that would kill an unprepared person were Eli's greatest ally. He heard them behind him, perhaps a mile back. There, progress marked by the beams of powerful flashlights cutting through the storm and the crack of branches as they forced their way through the undergrowth. And he smiled grimly at their mistakes. They were following his trail in a straight line, not anticipating that he would double back, circle around, and use the terrain to multiply the distance between them. He led them up a steep ravine that required climbing over ice-slicked boulders, then across a frozen creek where the ice was treacherous and thin, and finally into a dense thicket of mountain laurel that tore at clothes and skin, each obstacle carefully chosen to exhaust and demoralize men who were accustomed to controlled environments and urban hunting grounds. By the time he reached the halfway point, a natural shelf of rock that offered a brief respite from the wind, their lights had disappeared entirely, and the only sound was the storm's relentless howl. He allowed himself 2 minutes of rest, taking small sips from his water bottle and checking his hands and feet for the early signs of frostbite, then continued upward. The final 4 miles were a test of pure endurance, his legs burning, his lungs aching from the thin, cold air, but he pushed through the pain with the knowledge that stopping meant death, either from the cold or from the men who would eventually regroup and come after him with better equipment and local guides. The cabin appeared through the swirling snow, like a ghost, materializing from another time. A small log structure with a steeply pitched roof designed to shed snow, its windows shuttered, and its door secured with a padlock that yielded easily to the bolt cutter that had already proven its worth twice this night. He stumbled inside, slammed the door against the wind, and stood in the absolute darkness, listening to his own ragged breathing and the storm's fury battering the walls. The cabin was cold, untouched for 5 years since Daniel's death, but it was solid and dry, and most importantly, it was invisible, hidden so completely in the wilderness that even with maps and GPS, the men hunting him would need days to search the area systematically. He had bought himself time, perhaps 48 hours before they organized a proper search with tracking dogs and helicopters, and in that time, he needed to figure out how to turn the evidence he carried into a weapon that could protect him, how to contact the journalist in Seattle, and how to survive long enough to finish what Marcus Vance had started. The cabin had a small wood stove, and Eli worked by feel in the darkness to build a fire, his hands remembering the ritual that had kept him alive through 2 brutal winters, and soon a small flame was growing, casting dancing shadows across walls lined with old photographs and the preserved remnants of Daniel's life. He spread Marcus Vance's documents across a rough wooden table, arranging them by date and subject, and began the painstaking work of understanding the story they told, a story of corporate greed and systematic poisoning that was so vast in its scope and so deliberate in its execution that even after everything he had seen, it made him feel physically sick. The earliest documents dated back 8 years and were internal Titan Technologies memos discussing the cost of proper hazardous waste disposal, with one executive writing that the EPA-approved facilities charged rates that would significantly impact quarterly profits, and suggesting they explore alternative solutions. The alternative solution, laid out in subsequent documents with chilling bureaucratic precision, was to dump the waste illegally in remote mountain locations where detection was unlikely and consequences could be denied. The contamination came from Titan's manufacturing process, which produced circuit boards and industrial sensors using heavy metals, industrial solvents, and chemical compounds that were classified as extremely hazardous, and instead of paying the substantial fees required to dispose of these materials safely, the company had created a shadow operation that involved late-night truck convoys, bribed county inspectors, and carefully chosen dump sites in the high watersheds of Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming. Eli found maps marked with red X symbols, and next to each symbol were coordinates and photographs showing barrels being unloaded in pristine mountain valleys, their toxic contents seeping into the springs and creeks that fed the water systems of dozens of small communities downstream. There were lab reports obtained by Vance from independent testing showing arsenic levels in drinking water that were 40 times the federal safety limit, lead contamination that could cause permanent neurological damage in children, and industrial solvents linked to rare cancers. There were medical records, death certificates, and newspaper clippings documenting clusters of leukemia, brain tumors, and mysterious degenerative diseases in towns with names like Pine Creek, Silverbrook, and Timber Ridge, communities where people had lived for generations, drinking water that was slowly killing them. The cover-up was as elaborate as the crime itself, involving falsified EPA inspection reports, where officials who had been paid thousands of dollars certified that Titan's waste disposal practices met all federal standards, county health departments that dismissed complaints and attributed illnesses to environmental factors beyond our control, and state legislators who blocked investigations and cut funding for water quality monitoring. Vance had documented it all, recording conversations with board members who laughed about the hillbillies who don't know enough to ask questions, collecting evidence of wire transfers to offshore accounts held by public officials, and building a case that would have destroyed Titan and sent dozens of people to prison. But when he confronted the board, demanding they stop the dumping and fund a comprehensive cleanup, he was told that he had two choices: accept $10 million and sign a non-disclosure agreement that would legally prevent him from ever speaking about what he knew, or be destroyed professionally, financially, and if necessary, physically. The documents showed that Vance had refused, and that refusal had set in motion a campaign of intimidation and ultimately murder, because men who would poison children for profit would not hesitate to eliminate a single obstacle standing between them and continued wealth. Eli sat back from the table, the firelight flickering across his face, and understood that he was now that obstacle, that by taking these documents, he had inherited not just evidence, but a death sentence, and his only hope of survival was to make the truth so public, so undeniable, that killing him would be pointless. Searching the cabin for anything useful, Eli found a metal footlocker under the bed that contained Daniel's old camping gear, emergency supplies, and at the bottom, wrapped in a wool blanket, an ancient laptop computer that was at least a decade old, its casing scratched and worn, but its construction suggesting the kind of rugged durability favored by people who worked in the field. He carried it to the table, plugged it into the cabin's small solar-powered battery system that somehow still held a charge, and watched as the machine wheezed to life with a series of mechanical clicks that sounded painfully loud in the cabin's stillness. The operating system was outdated, the interface clunky and slow, but it functioned, and when Eli inserted the USB drive he had taken from the storage unit, the computer recognized it immediately, displaying a folder that contained dozens of files, documents, spreadsheets, photographs, and at the very top, a series of video files labeled with dates from 5 years ago. He clicked on the first video, and after a moment of buffering, Marcus Vance appeared on the screen, and Eli found himself face to face with the ghost whose mission he had inherited. Vance was perhaps 45 years old, with the kind of face that looked like it had once been handsome, but was now carved into haggard lines by stress and fear, his eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep, his hair disheveled. And behind him was the hidden room in the storage unit, the wall of evidence visible over his shoulder. His voice, when he spoke, was steady, but carried the weight of a man who knew he was recording his own eulogy, and he began by stating his full name, the date, and the fact that he was of sound mind and speaking freely without coercion. What followed was the most comprehensive testimony Eli could have imagined, a methodical recitation of facts delivered by a man who had spent months preparing for this moment. Vance named names, starting with Raymond Kovac, Titan's CEO, and moving through the entire board of directors, the plant managers who organized the dumping operations, the truck drivers who transported the waste, and the public officials who accepted bribes to ensure the crimes remained hidden. He provided specific dates, locations, and dollar amounts, describing in excruciating detail how the scheme worked, how the barrels were sourced, how the dump sites were chosen, and how the company had calculated that, even if they were eventually caught, the fines would be far less than the cost of proper disposal. He showed maps on camera, pointing to each contamination site and explaining which communities were being poisoned by each location, and his voice cracked with emotion when he described visiting Pine Creek and meeting families whose children were dying from cancers that should have been vanishingly rare. In the later videos, recorded just days before his disappearance, Vance spoke about his daughter Sophie, explaining that he had placed her in witness protection under a false identity, but had not told her why, believing that her ignorance would protect her from becoming a target. The final video was the shortest and the most devastating. Vance staring directly into the camera, with eyes that held both defiance and despair, and he spoke words that would echo in Eli's mind for days to come. If you are watching this, I am probably dead, which means they won, and the truth died with me. But it does not have to end there. I have given you everything you need to finish what I started, to expose these people, and make them pay for what they have done. I am begging you, whoever you are, please do not let them win. Please do not let those children's deaths be meaningless. please carry this fight forward, because I cannot." The screen went black, and Eli sat in the firelit cabin, tears streaming down his face, understanding that he had just been given a sacred trust by a dead man who had sacrificed everything for the truth. The sound of an engine cutting through the storm's diminishing roar jerked Eli from an exhausted sleep, and he grabbed the only weapon he had, a rusted fire poker from beside the stove, positioning himself behind the door as the vehicle approached. But the voice that called out was familiar and welcome, Ruth's voice telling him it was safe. She was alone, and she had brought supplies. He opened the door to find her climbing off an ancient snowmobile, her small frame bundled in layers of winter gear, and she was carrying 2 heavy bags that she thrust into his arms before stomping the snow from her boots and following him inside. She had brought food, real food, not just the emergency rations he had been rationing, along with warm clothes, batteries, medical supplies, and a thermos of hot soup that she insisted he drink immediately, while she built up the fire and settled into Daniel's old chair with the air of a woman who had made a difficult decision and would not be swayed from it. She told him that the men in suits had been back to the cafe, asking about him, showing his photograph to everyone in town, offering money for information about where he might have gone, and she had played dumb. Told them she remembered a ragged boy who swept her floors once, but had no idea where he went afterward. But she knew they would not give up, knew they would bring in more resources, and she had decided that she could not sit by and do nothing while another good person was hunted for trying to expose the truth. Then she told him about Daniel, and as she spoke, the pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with devastating clarity. Her husband had been investigating the same strange clusters of illness that Marcus Vance had documented, had been convinced that someone was deliberately contaminating the water supply, and had spent the last 2 years of his life taking water samples, interviewing families, and filing complaints with every agency that would listen. He had been building a case, she said, but he lacked the corporate insider knowledge to prove who was responsible. And 5 years ago, right around the time Marcus Vance disappeared, Daniel's truck had gone off a mountain road during a storm, a single-vehicle accident that everyone accepted as tragic but unsurprising given the dangerous conditions. But Daniel had driven that road 1,000 times, knew every curve and switchback, and Ruth had never believed the official story, had always known in her heart that he had gotten too close to something that powerful people needed to keep hidden. She looked at Eli with fierce determination, and told him that she had been waiting 5 years for someone to pick up the fight Daniel had started, someone brave enough, or desperate enough, or stubborn enough to stand against the people who thought they could poison children and murder whistleblowers without consequence. She offered him her help, her resources, and her absolute loyalty, because finishing this fight was the only way she could honor Daniel's memory and ensure that his death had meaning. Eli, overwhelmed by this fierce, elderly woman who had adopted his cause as her own, could only nod and show her Marcus Vance's videos, and together they began to plan how 2 people with nothing could take down a corporation with everything. They spent the next hours huddled over the laptop and the documents, Ruth's sharp mind cutting through the complexity of what Marcus Vance had assembled and organizing it into a strategy that had a slim chance of success. The journalist Vance had mentioned Ben Carter was still working in Seattle, Ruth confirmed, having followed his career over the years as he exposed corporate malfeasance and environmental crimes with a tenacity that had made him both respected and hated. Ruth had a contact, a former colleague of Daniel's who worked in telecommunications, and owed her a favor, someone who could set up a secure, encrypted connection that would allow them to upload the evidence without revealing their location or identity until it was too late for Titan to stop the transmission. But as they reviewed Vance's materials, they realized they had a critical problem. All the evidence was 5 years old, and while it proved historical crimes, a good lawyer could argue that the dumping had stopped, that the contamination was a past mistake for which Titan had already been punished through Vance's departure, and that the current leadership bore no responsibility. They needed fresh evidence, proof that the contamination was ongoing, that Titan was still poisoning communities today. And that meant someone had to physically visit one of the dump sites and document what they found. Ruth pulled out a topographical map and cross-referenced it with the coordinates Vance had provided, finding the nearest site was approximately 10 miles to the northwest, high in the mountains near a watershed that fed directly into Timber Ridge's water supply. The location was remote, accessible only by a brutal hike or by snowmobile if the snow conditions allowed, and there was no guarantee they would find anything after 5 years. But it was their best option, and perhaps their only chance to transform Vance's historical evidence into an immediate crisis that could not be ignored. Eli would make the journey, Ruth decided, because he had the youth and the mountain skills to navigate the terrain, while she would remain at the cabin and prepare the upload using her contact to establish the secure connection to Carter. They would document everything with photographs, take fresh water samples if possible, and if they found evidence of recent dumping, they would have proof that Titan's crimes were not ancient history, but an ongoing emergency. The plan was dangerous, requiring Eli to expose himself in the wilderness where Titan's men might be searching, but it was also necessary, the difference between a story that might be buried and one that would explode across national headlines with such force that even Titan's money and influence could not contain it. They would move at first light, Ruth said, and Eli nodded, understanding that they were no longer running or hiding, but had become hunters themselves, stalking a corporation that thought itself untouchable, and the success or failure of their mission would determine whether Marcus Vance and Daniel had died for nothing, or whether their deaths would finally bring justice to the families who had suffered, while powerful men profited from their pain. Dawn broke cold and clear, the storm having passed, and left behind a landscape of pristine snow that would make their tracks painfully visible to anyone following. But they had no choice except to move forward with a plan that had become their only hope for survival. Ruth's snowmobile carried them both across the lower slopes, its engine a roaring intrusion in the mountain silence, until the terrain became too steep and broken for the machine to navigate, and then they continued on foot, Eli breaking trail through snow that was sometimes waist-deep while Ruth followed in his path, her breath coming in labored gasps, but her determination never wavering. The coordinates led them to a narrow valley carved by a spring-fed creek that would be rushing with meltwater in summer, but was now locked under ice. And as they climbed higher, following the creek toward its source, Eli spotted what they had come to find, a dirt access road that had been plowed recently, the snow pushed aside to reveal muddy tire tracks that were no more than a few days old. They followed the road with increasing caution, using the tree line for cover, and soon they saw it, a sight so brazen in its criminality that even after everything Eli had learned, it took his breath away. There was a clearing where the spring emerged from the mountain, a sacred place where pure water had flowed for thousands of years, and it had been violated with industrial efficiency. Heavy steel barrels stacked on pallets, each one labeled with false manifests claiming they contained industrial lubricants or cleaning supplies, and a motorized pump system that was actively transferring the contents of the barrels into a sealed cistern that fed directly into the spring. The snow around the site was stained with chemical residue, a rainbow sheen on the white surface, and the air carried a sharp, acrid smell that made Eli's eyes water. He pulled out the small digital camera Ruth had provided, a relic from Daniel's activist days, and began photographing everything: the barrels with their false labels, the pump system, the stained snow, the cistern, and most damning of all, the Titan Technologies logo that was stamped on the pump equipment. Ruth collected a water sample from the spring downstream of the contamination site, her hands shaking as she sealed the bottle, and they were so focused on documenting the crime that they almost missed the sound of engines approaching from down the access road. Eli grabbed Ruth's arm, pulling her toward the tree line, but they were too slow, and as they reached the edge of the clearing, 2 black SUVs rounded the bend and stopped, disgorging 6 men in tactical gear who spread out with the practiced efficiency of a military unit, cutting off every escape route. The lead man, tall and cold-eyed with the bearing of someone who had done this kind of work before, raised his hand in a gesture that was both a greeting and a threat, and his voice carried across the clearing with chilling calm. "That camera, son. Hand it over, and maybe we can all walk away from this." Eli looked at Ruth, saw the fear in her eyes, but also the fierce defiance, and knew that walking away was never an option they would be given, because these men had not come to negotiate, but to erase the evidence and everyone who had seen it. The men moved with professional efficiency, zip-tying Eli's and Ruth's hands behind their backs, and conducting a thorough search that relieved them of the camera, the water sample, and the USB drive Eli had foolishly brought with him, thinking it would be safer on his person than left at the cabin. The lead man, who introduced himself as Garrett with the casual politeness of someone who knew his victims had no power to resist, made a phone call while his team secured their prisoners, and Eli heard him say words that made his blood run cold. "We have them. Both. The boy and the old woman. And yes, they found the dump site. They have photographs and samples. No, sir, I do not believe they had time to transmit anything, but we will need to verify that before we proceed with disposal." They were loaded into one of the SUVs, Garrett sitting in the front passenger seat, while 2 armed men flanked Eli and Ruth in the back, and the convoy drove for nearly an hour, leaving the mountains and descending into a remote valley where a cluster of industrial buildings sat surrounded by chain-link fence and posted with faded "No Trespassing" signs. This was one of Titan's manufacturing facilities, supposedly decommissioned 5 years ago according to public records, but as they drove through the gate and into a loading bay, Eli could see that the plant was very much operational, its smokestacks dark, but its interior lights blazing, and the hum of machinery audible even through the SUV's closed windows. They were taken to a windowless room in the administrative wing, stripped of their outer layers and possessions, and secured to metal chairs that were bolted to the concrete floor, the zip ties replaced with handcuffs that bit into Eli's wrists with professional tightness. Garrett entered, carrying a tablet computer and a bottle of water that he sipped from while studying them, with the detached interest of a scientist examining specimens. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried no anger or malice, only the flat certainty of a man delivering information that could not be changed. He explained that Titan's executive board had been monitoring the situation since the storage unit was breached, that they had hoped to contain the problem quietly by retrieving the evidence and eliminating the witnesses. But Eli's flight into the mountains and Ruth's involvement had complicated matters and increased the risk of exposure beyond acceptable levels. The decision had been made at the highest levels, Garrett said, that permanent disposal was the only solution that adequately protected the company's interests, and while he personally found the situation regrettable, he was a professional who followed orders and completed assignments, and this assignment would be completed within the next 12 hours. But first, he needed to know one critical piece of information. Had they shared the evidence with anyone else, uploaded files to the internet, contacted journalists or law enforcement, or in any way created copies that might survive their deaths? He needed the truth, Garrett said, because if the evidence had been distributed, the disposal plan would need to be modified. But if it remained contained, then their deaths would effectively end the threat. The interrogation, he promised, would be thorough. Garrett left them alone for what might have been an hour, or might have been 3, time losing meaning in the windowless room, where the only sound was the hum of fluorescent lights, and Ruth's steady breathing beside him. And in that enforced stillness, Eli found himself confronting truths he had spent 2 years avoiding. He had survived on the mountain, yes, endured cold and hunger and loneliness that would have broken most people. But survival was not the same as living, and he understood now that he had been hiding, running from a world that had discarded him, choosing invisibility over the risk of being seen and rejected again. Marcus Vance had been a billionaire with everything to lose, wealth and reputation and a comfortable life. But he had sacrificed it all because he understood that some truths were more important than personal safety, that silence in the face of evil was itself a form of evil. Ruth had been a widow living quietly with her grief, but when she saw someone fighting the same battle her husband had died for, she had risked everything to help a ragged stranger who had given her no reason to trust him, except the evidence that he cared about justice. These people had shown him what courage looked like, what it meant to stand for something larger than survival, and sitting in that cold room with handcuffs biting into his wrists and death waiting just hours away, Eli felt something ignite in his chest that was not fear, but purpose, a fierce burning determination that transformed him from a victim waiting for execution into a fighter looking for his moment. He began to assess his environment with the same systematic attention he had applied to surviving on the mountain, cataloguing every detail that might become a tool or a weapon. The handcuffs were standard police issue, tight but not impossibly so, and 2 years of lean living meant his wrists were thin enough that with enough pain and persistence he might be able to slip one hand free. The chair was bolted to the floor, but the bolts looked old, the concrete around them cracked and flaking, and if he could work the chair loose, it became a bludgeon. The room's door was solid, but he noticed the hinges were on the inside, accessible, and the pins looked worn enough that determined effort might remove them. The ceiling tiles were the flimsy drop-in kind that hid a crawl space above, and while he could not reach them while cuffed to the chair, if he could get free, that crawl space might lead to other rooms, to ventilation shafts, to any of the 100 vulnerabilities that old buildings always possessed. Ruth, watching him with her sharp eyes, seemed to understand what he was thinking, and she gave him the smallest nod of encouragement, her mouth forming silent words. Daniel would be proud. That broke something in Eli's chest, some final wall he had built between himself and the world, and he felt tears sting his eyes even as his jaw set with determination, because he understood now that he was not alone, had never truly been alone, and whether he survived the next 12 hours or died trying, he would face it not as an invisible, forgotten boy, but as someone who had found something worth dying for, which meant he had finally found something worth living for. The breakthrough came when Eli, working his wrist back and forth despite the pain, managed to pull his hand through the handcuff at the cost of torn skin and blood, and once one hand was free, the rest followed quickly. He removed his belt, used the metal buckle to work at the corroded bolts holding his chair to the floor, and after 20 minutes of grinding effort that made his shoulders scream, the chair broke loose from its moorings. He freed Ruth using the same technique, her thin wrists sliding through the cuffs more easily than his, and together they approached the door, where Eli used a technique he had learned from examining the miner's shack's ancient hinges. He wedged the chair leg under the door and used it as a lever to lift upward, putting pressure on the hinge pins until they began to slide free of their housings. The door came off its hinges with barely a sound, and they were out, moving through corridors that were lit only by emergency lighting, and lined with pipes that gurgled and hissed with whatever chemicals the plant was processing. They moved like ghosts, Eli drawing on 2 years of silent movement through the wilderness, guiding Ruth through the shadows, and freezing whenever they heard voices or footsteps echoing from other parts of the facility. As they navigated deeper, searching for an exit, they began to notice things that should not exist in a decommissioned plant. Fresh chemical smells that burned their nostrils, the throb of active machinery behind closed doors, and most damningly, a loading dock where workers in protective suits were wheeling barrels marked with false manifests toward idling trucks. This facility was not shut down. It was running full operations under the cover of darkness and official denials, and the scale of what they were seeing suggested that the mountain dump site was just one small piece of a network that stretched across multiple states. Eli pulled Ruth behind a stack of pallets as a supervisor walked past, his radio crackling with routine production updates, and they heard him tell someone that the next shipment needed to be ready by UO 400 for the run to the Idaho site. Confirmation that the poisoning was not historical, but ongoing, systematic, and far larger than Marcus Vance's evidence had revealed. They needed to get out, needed to survive long enough to tell this story. But as they worked their way toward what looked like a maintenance exit, they heard the alarm, a piercing wail that echoed through the entire facility, followed by Garrett's voice over the intercom. "Code Red. 2 prisoners escaped from holding. Seal all exits and initiate lockdown procedures. Shoot on sight if necessary." The lights came on, brilliant and blinding, and suddenly their path was cut off by running footsteps and shouted commands. Ruth grabbed Eli's hand, her grip surprisingly strong, and pulled him toward a door marked Hazardous Materials Storage, the one place guards might hesitate to follow, and they plunged inside as the facility erupted into chaos around them, knowing they had minutes at most before being cornered, and their only hope was to find a way out of this industrial labyrinth that had become both a crime scene and a death trap. The hazardous materials storage room had a loading door that opened directly onto the mountain behind the facility, and they burst out into a night that had transformed once again into a white, howling chaos. Another blizzard slamming into the peaks with a kind of intensity that turned the world into a disorienting blur of wind and snow. Behind them, alarms shrieked and voices shouted commands, and within seconds of their escape, the pursuit began, Garrett's team emerging from multiple exits to fan out across the snowy slope, their powerful flashlights cutting through the storm like searchlights hunting prey. Eli and Ruth ran upward, the only direction that offered any hope of losing their pursuers. But within the first mile, he realized that Ruth was failing, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her pace slowing despite her determination, and he understood with cold certainty that they would not both survive if they stayed together. He pulled her behind an outcropping of a rock, their pursuers momentarily lost in the white chaos below them, and he told her what had to happen, his voice barely audible over the wind's roar. He would take the evidence they had recovered from Garrett during their escape, the photographs and the water sample, and led the hunters away while she made for the cabin where the real evidence waited. The USB drive with Vance's testimony, the documents that proved everything, and she would use her contact to get it all to Ben Carter before Titan could stop her. Ruth protested, her voice breaking, telling him he was just a boy, that she could not let him sacrifice himself. But Eli was no longer that invisible, frightened child who had hidden on the mountain for 2 years. He pressed the materials into her hands, told her exactly how to reach the cabin from this position, and made her promise that she would not stop, would not look back, would not let his choice be meaningless by failing to complete the mission. This was his fight now, he said, his purpose, the reason he had survived, when he should have died 12 times over. And he needed her to trust him, the way she had trusted him from the moment he walked into her cafe. She pulled him into a fierce embrace, whispered that Daniel would have loved him, that she loved him. And then she was gone, disappearing into the storm in the direction of safety. Eli waited only long enough to be sure she had a decent head start. Then he did something that took every ounce of courage he possessed. He stood up on the outcropping, making himself visible to the hunters below, and shouted a challenge that was stolen by the wind, but accomplished its purpose. The flashlight beams swung toward him, voices called out his position, and Garrett's team began climbing toward him with renewed intensity. Eli smiled grimly, turned, and ran deeper into the wilderness he knew better than anyone alive, the ghost of the mountain leading the hunters away from everything that mattered, and toward a reckoning that would be decided not by money or power, but by will and knowledge, and the fierce determination of a boy who had finally found something worth fighting for. The mountain became Eli's ally. Every rock and tree and hidden ravine, a weapon he had spent 2 years learning to wield. And he led Garrett's team into terrain that would test even experienced mountaineers in good conditions, and was nearly suicidal in a blizzard. He took them up a false trail that seemed to promise easy passage, but ended at a cliff face where they had to backtrack, burning energy and time. Then across a frozen stream where he knew the ice was dangerously thin on the far bank, and he heard the crack and the scream as one man plunged through into water cold enough to kill in minutes. He led them into a narrow ravine choked with unstable snow, and when they were committed to the passage with no easy retreat, he climbed above them and triggered a small avalanche by dislodging a cornice, not enough snow to kill, but sufficient to bury 2 men to their waists and force the others to spend precious minutes digging them free. He moved like smoke through the storm, appearing just long enough to draw them forward, disappearing before they could get a clear shot, always staying just beyond their reach, while the cold and exhaustion and fear did his work for him. When one man separated from the group, struggling to keep pace, Eli circled back and disabled him with a rock to the back of the knee, not killing, but ensuring he could not continue, then melted back into the white chaos before the others even realized their companion had fallen. He picked them off one by one through the long, brutal night, using the terrain and the storm and their own exhaustion against them, and by the time dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, only Garrett remained, and the hunter had become prey. Eli found him in a shallow depression, his expensive tactical gear no match for the mountain's relentless cold, his radio dead from moisture damage, his GPS useless in the storm, and his face showing the first grey pallor of hypothermia. Garrett looked up as Eli approached, his weapon raised, but his hand shaking too badly to aim, and in his eyes was the terrible understanding that he had been outmatched from the beginning by an opponent he had fatally underestimated. Eli kicked the weapon away, took Garrett's backup, radio, and his satellite phone, and knelt in the snow to look the man in the eyes. He told Garrett that he was leaving him here, that rescue teams would find him within hours once Ruth made her call, and that he would spend whatever time remained testifying about everything he had done for Titan Technologies, or he could refuse and spend the rest of his life in prison watching others testify instead. The choice, Eli said, was whether Garrett wanted to be remembered as a mercenary who followed evil orders, or as the man whose testimony helped bring down a corporation that poisoned children for profit. Then Eli stood, took the evidence of Garrett's crimes from his pack, and walked away down the mountain, leaving the professional killer shivering in the snow, defeated not by superior firepower, but by a homeless boy who had learned that survival was not enough, and that sometimes the only way to truly live was to fight for something larger than yourself. Ruth made it to the cabin as the storm began to break, her body pushed beyond what should have been possible for a woman of her age, driven by the knowledge that a boy was risking his life to buy her this chance, and she would not waste it. She fired up the old laptop, used the satellite phone connection her telecommunications contact had arranged, and within minutes was speaking to Ben Carter in Seattle, her voice shaking, but her words clear and precise as she explained what she had, who she was, and why he needed to listen immediately. Carter, who had been investigating corporate environmental crimes for 20 years and had developed the instincts to separate genuine whistleblowers from attention seekers within the first 30 seconds of conversation, heard something in Ruth's voice that made him sit up and start recording. And as she began uploading files, beginning with Marcus Vance's video testimony, he watched with growing horror and then fierce joy as he realized he was looking at the most comprehensive corporate crime documentation he had ever encountered. The videos were devastating, showing a dead man explaining in meticulous detail how Titan Technologies had poisoned communities across 3 states, and the supporting documents provided proof that would satisfy even the most skeptical editor or prosecutor. Carter made a decision that would define his career. He would not sit on this story, would not spend weeks verifying every detail, because the people sending him this evidence were clearly in mortal danger, and delay, might mean their deaths and the story's suppression. He activated a protocol he had established with colleagues at major publications, a network of investigative journalists who had agreed to simultaneously publish stories too dangerous for any single organization to handle alone. And within 3 hours of Ruth's first contact, the story exploded across multiple platforms. The New York Times led with "Tech Giant Accused of Systematic Poisoning of Rural Communities." The Washington Post ran "Dead Whistleblowers' Evidence Reveals Decades of Environmental Crimes," and Reuters distributed the story internationally with copies of Marcus Vance's videos and the most damning documents. The response was immediate and catastrophic for Titan Technologies. Their stock price, which had opened at $83 per share, plummeted to $19 by market close as investors fled. Federal investigators from the EPA and FBI mobilized strike teams to secure Titan facilities before evidence could be destroyed, and the Attorney General announced a press conference to discuss criminal charges against multiple executives, including CEO Raymond Kovacs. Arrest warrants were issued before sunset, and by the time the evening news broadcasts led with footage of FBI agents raiding Titan's corporate headquarters, the story had become too big, too public, and too well documented to suppress, bury, or deny. And somewhere in the Montana mountains, Ruth allowed herself to cry, knowing that Daniel's death and Marcus Vance's sacrifice and Eli's courage had finally, after so many years of silence, forced the truth into the light where it could not be extinguished. The search and rescue team found Eli 12 hours after he had left Garrett on the mountain, his body temperature dangerously low and his movements sluggish with the kind of exhaustion that preceded collapse. But his eyes were clear, and his grip on consciousness was fierce as he refused the helicopter evacuation until they confirmed that Ruth was safe and that the story had been published. They wrapped him in thermal blankets, started an IV to combat dehydration, and flew him to the regional hospital in Kalispell, where doctors treated him for moderate hypothermia, severe dehydration, lacerations to his hands and wrists, and malnutrition that spoke of months, if not years, of inadequate food. By the time he woke in a clean hospital bed with warm blankets and the steady beep of monitors tracking his vital signs, the world had transformed around him in ways he could not have imagined. The story had become a national sensation, and the evening news broadcasts leading with footage of federal agents raiding Titan facilities, while Marcus Vance's face, alongside Eli's school photo from years ago, appeared on every screen in America. Ruth was there when he woke, sitting in the visitor's chair, with tears streaming down her face, and she told him that he had done it, that the truth was out and could never be buried again, that Marcus Vance and Daniel and all the victims would finally have justice. The hospital room became a revolving door of FBI agents, EPA investigators, and prosecutors who needed his testimony, and Eli found himself recounting the story over and over: the storage unit auction, the hidden room, the documents and videos, the capture and escape. The evidence of ongoing contamination that proved Titan's crimes were not historical, but current and systematic. The agents told him that the investigation was revealing a conspiracy far larger than even Vance had documented, with contamination affecting an estimated 50,000 people across Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming, and forensic analysis of death certificates suggesting that dozens of people had died from cancers and other illnesses directly attributable to Titan's dumping. The corruption reached into state government, with 3 state legislators and a dozen county officials already arrested for accepting bribes, and Raymond Kovacs, Titan's CEO, had been taken into custody while attempting to board a private plane to a country with no extradition treaty. Eli's testimony, they explained, would be crucial to the prosecution, the linchpin that connected all the evidence and proved the chain of custody from Marcus Vance's original investigation to the present day. The hospital administration treated him like visiting royalty. The nurses competed to bring him extra food, and the local television stations ran stories about the homeless hero who had taken down a corrupt corporation. But as the attention mounted, as the reporters camped outside his hospital room, and the strangers reached out with offers of book deals and movie rights and full college scholarships. Eli felt not triumph, but a suffocating pressure that made him want to flee back to his abandoned miner's shack, where the world had been simple, and the only questions were whether he would eat that day, and whether he would survive the night. He was 16 years old, still a boy despite everything he had endured, and the magnitude of what he had become, a symbol and a hero, and a witness whose testimony would send powerful people to prison, was crushing him, beneath expectations he never asked for and did not know how to meet. Ruth, watching him withdraw despite the celebration around him, understood what he needed before he could articulate it himself, and she began quietly working to shield him from the attention, to create space for him to process what had happened, and to figure out who he was now that he was no longer invisible, no longer forgotten, no longer just a boy surviving alone on a mountain, but someone the world had seen and would never let disappear again. Sophie Vance arrived at the hospital 3 days after the story broke, and when she walked into Eli's room, he saw immediately that she was her father's daughter, carrying the same precise intelligence in her eyes and the same determined set to her jaw that he had seen in Marcus Vance's videos. She was 19, dressed simply in jeans and a sweater, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, and she carried herself with the careful control of someone who had learned to hide her true identity and suppress her emotions for so long that naturalness had become an act of will. She sat in the chair beside his bed, and for a long moment they simply looked at each other. Two people whose lives had been shattered by the same conspiracy, and who were now bound together by a dead man's legacy. She told him her story, how 5 years ago her father had placed her in witness protection under a false identity, how she had spent her college years as Sarah Mitchell from Oregon, attending classes and making friends while never being able to explain why she had no family photographs, or why she flinched every time someone used her fake name. She had not known why she was in protection, had been told only that her father had made enemies, and that her safety required absolute secrecy. And when she learned of his disappearance, she had been forbidden from attending a memorial service, or even acknowledging publicly that Marcus Vance had been her father. The evidence Eli had found and Ruth had published had finally freed her from that prison of false identity, had given her the truth about why her father had vanished, and the knowledge that his death had not been meaningless, but had been a sacrifice for something larger than himself. She thanked Eli with tears streaming down her face, telling him that he had given her back her father's memory, had transformed him from a man who had seemingly abandoned her into a hero who had fought to his last breath to protect her and expose the truth. Then she told him something that made his world tilt once again, pulling from her bag a legal document that bore her father's signature and the seal of a law firm in Seattle. Marcus Vance, she explained, had established a trust fund years ago, with specific instructions that it should be given to whoever completes the mission and brings the evidence to light. And the law firm, acting on those instructions after verifying that the mission had been completed, had determined that Eli was the rightful beneficiary. The trust, funded by stock options Vance had cashed out before his disappearance, and investments that had grown substantially over 5 years, was worth $3.7 million, and it was now Eli's to do with as he saw fit. Eli stared at the document, his mind unable to process the numbers, unable to reconcile the concept of millions of dollars with the reality of a boy who 3 weeks ago had owned nothing but the clothes on his back and a battered rucksack. He tried to speak, to say something, but the words would not come, and Sophie, understanding his shock, simply took his hand and told him that her father would have been proud of him, that Marcus Vance had been a man who believed in justice and courage and the kind of stubborn determination that refused to let evil win, and he had seen those qualities in the person he hoped would finish his work. The money was not charity, she said, and it was not payment for services rendered. It was a recognition that Eli had done something most people would never have the courage to do, and her father had wanted to ensure that whoever took up his fight would have the resources to build a life afterward, to have the choices and opportunities that courage deserved. The weeks following Sophie's revelation were a blur of possibilities that left Eli feeling unmoored and uncertain. Lawyers and financial advisors explaining investment strategies and tax implications in language he barely understood, reporters requesting interviews about what he planned to do with his fortune, and well-meaning social workers suggesting programs and schools that could help him catch up on the education and experiences he had missed. He could go anywhere, they told him, be anyone, attend any university, live in any city, start fresh with a new identity, in a place where no one knew him as the homeless boy who had taken down Titan Technologies. But as he sat in Ruth's cafe, which had become his refuge from the overwhelming attention, drinking coffee and listening to her talk about Daniel's dreams of a world where corporations could not poison communities with impunity, he began to understand that running to somewhere else would be just another form of hiding, another way of making himself invisible when what he had fought for was the right to be seen. Sophie visited often during those weeks, and they formed a bond that neither of them had expected. Two people who had been shaped by Marcus Vance's mission, and who understood the strange mix of grief and purpose that came from completing a dead man's work. She told him about her plans to finish her degree in environmental science, to use her father's name, now cleared of all suspicion, to advocate for stronger regulations and oversight. And she asked Eli what he wanted to build with the resources her father had left him. Ben Carter, who had become something of a mentor through their phone conversations, told Eli that the world would move on to the next scandal within months, that fame was fleeting, but impact could be permanent, and that the best way to honor what he had been through was to transform his pain into something that helped others who were suffering as he had suffered. In the quiet moments alone, Eli found himself hiking back to the place where his miner's shack had stood, the abandoned structure that had been his home and prison for 2 years. And as he stood in the clearing, looking at the mountains that had nearly killed him, but had also taught him everything about survival and strength, he realized that he did not want to leave. This was home, not because it was comfortable or easy, but because it was where he had learned who he was, and running from it would be a betrayal of that hard-won knowledge. He bought the land, 40 acres of mountain wilderness that included his old shack and the surrounding forest, and hired local contractors to build not a mansion, but a simple, solid home with room for guests, and a workshop where he could work with his hands. He established the Vance Shepherd Foundation, named for Marcus and for himself, dedicated to helping homeless youth in Montana with housing, education, job training, and the kind of practical support that recognized their resilience rather than treating them as broken victims. Sophie joined him as a partner in the foundation, bringing her organizational skills and her father's connections, and together they began building something that would outlast the news cycle and the criminal trials. Ruth, who had become the grandmother Eli never had, sold her cafe and moved into a small cottage on his land, where she could finally rest after years of grief and fighting, knowing that Daniel's death had led to something meaningful. The three of them, an unlikely family forged in the crucible of conspiracy and courage, sat on Eli's porch on a clear autumn evening, watching the sun set over the mountains, and Eli understood that he was no longer invisible or forgotten, no longer surviving, but living, and the home he had built was not just a structure of wood and stone, but a place where broken people could find the strength to become whole again. 6 months after the truth exploded across the nation's consciousness, Eli stood on the porch of his completed home, a structure built from local timber and stone that sat on the exact spot where his miner's shack had once leaned against the mountain's fury, and he watched the autumn sun paint the peaks in shades of gold and crimson. While behind him, through the open door, he could hear Ruth humming as she prepared dinner, and Sophie laughing on the phone as she coordinated the Foundation's newest program to provide wilderness survival training to homeless teenagers. The legal machinery had ground forward with the inexorable weight of justice finally unleashed. Raymond Kovacs and 11 other Titan executives were on trial in federal court, facing charges that ranged from environmental crimes to conspiracy to commit murder. And Garrett, true to his survival instincts, had become the prosecution's star witness, his testimony revealing a network of corruption that extended far beyond what even Marcus Vance had documented. More arrests were coming, the prosecutor had told Eli during their last meeting, as lower-level conspirators made deals to testify against their superiors, and the company itself, stripped of its leadership and hemorrhaging money from lawsuits and cleanup costs, would likely not survive the year. The contaminated watersheds were being cleaned up under EPA supervision, a massive remediation project that would take years, but had already begun removing the poison that had seeped into the mountains, and the affected communities were receiving compensation through a settlement fund that, while it could never restore the lives that had been lost, at least acknowledged that their suffering had been real and unjust. Eli had testified at the trials, his words helping to put faces and names to the thousands of victims who had been reduced to statistics in Titan's internal memos, and he had watched Raymond Kovacs' face as the man realized that a homeless boy he had tried to erase had become the instrument of his destruction. But the trials and the headlines were not what filled Eli's days now. Instead, he spent his time working with the Foundation, meeting with the young people who came through their programs, listening to their stories of survival and loss, and showing them through his own example that being forgotten by the world did not mean you had to forget yourself. The Foundation had helped 32 homeless youth in its first 6 months, providing them with housing, education, therapy, and most importantly, the message that their lives had value and their resilience was strength rather than damage. Sophie had become not just his partner in this work, but the sister he had never had. And together, they were building something that honored both her father's sacrifice and Eli's hard-won understanding that survival was not enough, that the true measure of a life was what you built with the time you were given. He had legally changed his name to Eli Vance Shepherd, carrying forward both the legacy of the man whose mission he had completed and his own identity as someone who had learned to survive in the wilderness. And when people asked him about the hyphenated name, he explained that it represented the two parts of himself, the fighter and the survivor, the activist and the mountain boy, the public figure and the private person who still needed the quiet of the peaks to feel whole. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Ruth called him inside for dinner, and he took one last look at the mountains that had been his prison and his teacher, his near death and his salvation, understanding finally that home was not a place you found, but a place you built, and family was not something you were born into, but something you chose to create with the people who stood beside you when the world tried to break you, and in saving others from the invisibility and forgetting that had nearly destroyed him, he had finally, completely, and irrevocably saved himself.